Summer 1941 brought a sun that seared the steppes of Ukraine, a heat that baked the cracked mud roads and twisted the wheels of Soviet trucks into useless tangles of metal. From the air, the Germans saw what they believed to be chaos: derelict supply depots, rusted locomotives snaking along fractured rail lines, and soldiers queuing for rations that never came. The Wehrmacht laughed in their field reports, dispatches sent back to the High Command filled with contempt for a system they deemed hopelessly inefficient. "Red Army logistics are a joke," wrote Oberstleutnant Friedrich von Rabenau, whose 6th Panzer Division had pierced the Ukrainian front near Zhytomyr. "Their trucks crumble like dry bread, and men forage for scraps while generals shuffle papers in distant cities." The Germans mocked openly. In officers' diaries captured later, phrases like, "The Russians starve in plain sight," and "Their trains move at a snail's pace, yet the men still march," peppered pages alongside crude sketches of sagging wagons and skeletal horses dragging supply sleds. Field photographers documented what appeared to confirm the derision: crates of spoiled grain spilling onto muddy ground, overturned carts blocking minor roads, smoke curling from engines that had seized from lack of fuel. The Wehrmacht interpreted every sign of struggle as confirmation of Soviet weakness. Yet beneath the surface, a resilience flickered. Soviet supply officers worked feverishly, improvising where rail lines had been bombed, patching trucks with scrap metal, and sending horse-drawn wagons into regions where roads were impassable. Red Army soldiers endured long marches on empty stomachs, often subsisting on foraged roots, dried bread, and, when luck permitted, small portions of preserved meat. Diaries recovered from rifle regiments described nights spent sleeping in ruined barns, ration tins passed hand to hand with whispered encouragements. "Tomorrow we push again. We survive." Reports from German forward units reveal the initial shock of encountering Soviet endurance under logistical collapse. A Panzer reconnaissance officer near Berdichev noted, "Their formations are ragged, yet they continue forward. Each man carries what they can, sharing food and ammunition among comrades as if the empty trucks mattered little. It is inefficient, but it is relentless." While the High Command laughed at the inefficiency, these small acts of improvisation hinted at a sturdiness the Germans would not fully appreciate until years later. The mocking extended beyond reports. Intelligence officers compiling dossiers on Soviet divisions scribbled notes on Soviet backwardness, cataloguing trains stranded on sidings, trucks immobilized by mud or engine failure, and depots raided and burned by their own soldiers to prevent capture. "The Soviets cannot feed themselves," one memo concluded, oblivious to the patchwork of ingenuity fueling continued resistance. Even as the Wehrmacht celebrated rapid advances, Kiev fell in September, vast swathes of farmland were occupied. The rear echelon groaned under the logistics of supplying armoured columns. Yet, ironically, it was this same supply strain that kept German officers blind to the quiet, slow recovery in the Soviet rear areas. Soviet commanders, constrained by what resources remained, began improvising innovative solutions. Rail lines, partially destroyed by retreating units, were repaired with field expedients. Requisitioned trucks were cannibalized for parts, keeping a skeleton network moving eastward. Horses, often underestimated by German observers, became indispensable, carrying rations, ammunition, and medical supplies into areas where vehicles could not traverse. Letters from Red Army quartermasters illustrate a constant tension between necessity and impossibility, yet every ration delivered to frontline troops became a small victory against despair. By late summer, as the German armies prepared for the drive toward Smolensk and beyond, small reports surfaced hinting at an unseen factor poised to tip the scales. In Moscow, planners quietly acknowledged incoming shipments from across the Atlantic: canned meats, powdered milk, and other durable provisions prepared for the long haul. The Lend-Lease program, authorized by the U.S. Congress earlier that year, promised tons of sustenance capable of reaching Soviet soldiers even when railroads failed or trucks broke down. While German officers dismissed rumors of American aid as propaganda, Soviet commanders quietly welcomed every crate and pallet, imagining a future where starvation would no longer dictate the tempo of operations. In villages along the Dnieper, Soviet soldiers scavenged the remains of their logistics network, stacking broken wagons to create temporary depots, and rationing flour, salted fish, and the occasional meat preserved in tins. Field nurses and medics organized ad hoc kitchens, stretching meagre supplies to feed the thousands of troops streaming from Moscow's hinterlands to reinforce the front. In letters later sent home, soldiers describe a grim humor. "We eat what the road gives us. Tomorrow, perhaps the Americans will send food too." These notes, seemingly trivial, capture the first flickers of a monumental transformation in Soviet supply chains, one that German command would come to rue. Meanwhile, the German High Command continued its ridicule, confident that Soviet logistical collapse would soon translate into battlefield defeat. Briefings emphasized that, without fuel, without food, without trains, the Red Army will crumble before winter. Officers on the front shared jokes about feeding the enemy. Why bother capturing Moscow? The men there are too thin to fight. The Wehrmacht remained blind to a quiet revolution in Soviet sustainment, improvisation, resilience, and soon the infusion of American resources would alter the trajectory of the Eastern Front in ways no German officer anticipated. By August, Operation Barbarossa had pressed deep into Ukraine, and reports from the front lines mixed triumph with concern. The Germans advanced, yet pockets of resistance persisted where the Red Army was thought broken. These were the soldiers who had endured without proper rations, who had marched in the summer heat, fought through exhaustion, and relied on ingenuity rather than conventional logistics. Their survival, documented in post-war memoirs, underscored the central irony of the early campaign. German mockery of Soviet supply chains overlooked the quiet, persistent lifelines being maintained by the very troops they considered weak. The stage was set. What the Wehrmacht saw as chaos was in fact the first act of a sustained logistical effort, soon to be amplified by a continent-spanning industrial alliance. As autumn approached, and as the first shipments of US rations began to navigate Arctic ports, the Red Army's endurance under extreme conditions hinted at a future the Germans had not prepared for. Millions of soldiers sustained by tins of Spam, cans of corned beef, and the resolve of men who refused to starve. The mockery of summer 1941 would not survive the winter. And in the shadows of shattered railways and broken trucks, the first whispers of a supply miracle began to circulate, one that would feed not just men, but victory itself. By late 1941, across the Atlantic, a different kind of machinery was awakening, one whose influence would soon eclipse the battlefield blunders of summer. In sprawling industrial complexes from Chicago to Pittsburgh, Detroit to Minneapolis, American factories began producing rations, vehicles, and essential supplies with a precision and scale unparalleled in history. Corned beef, powdered milk, butter, canned fruits, and the famous Spam rolled off conveyor belts in quantities measured not by tons, but by thousands of tons. It was the birth of an unprecedented logistical partnership, one that would extend the reach of American industry into the frozen warehouses and battered rail depots of the Soviet Union. The Lend-Lease Act, signed in March 1941, had authorized this immense effort. Early shipments focused on durable goods, items capable of surviving long transit without refrigeration, spoilage, or damage. Crates of canned meats and dried vegetables were carefully packed into steel containers, then stacked onto Liberty ships bound for ports along the Arctic route, a treacherous pathway that would later become infamous for storms, ice, and the ever-present threat of German U-boats. Each shipment required meticulous planning. Naval records from 1942 indicate that convoys like PQ-17 had to be organized with precision down to the last crate. An error in weight distribution could imperil the entire convoy in the frigid Arctic seas. Across the ocean, Soviet logistics officers waited in anxious anticipation. Ports like Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, still scarred from years of neglect, were ill-equipped to handle the volumes of incoming supplies. Yet the Red Army's engineers adapted. Wooden piers were reinforced, temporary cranes erected, and railway spurs extended to unload ships before winter ice closed the harbour. These improvised solutions allowed tons of American rations to flow inland, first to staging depots, then to the front lines where the men, still marching on empty stomachs, would receive their first taste of sustained nourishment. The earliest shipments were modest in scale, often delayed by weather, enemy action, and logistical bottlenecks. Yet their impact was immediate and profound. Memoirs from rifle regiments later described the shock of receiving crates of Spam, corned beef, and powdered milk. Soldiers who had subsisted on foraged roots and stale bread suddenly found calories sufficient to sustain prolonged combat. For the first time in weeks, I did not feel the ache in my stomach, wrote Private Ivan Petrov of the 96th Rifle Division, stationed near Smolensk. The crates arrived like gifts from another world. It was not only the rations that mattered. US factories also produced thousands of trucks, jeeps, and trailers, designed for rugged use in harsh climates. By 1942, hundreds of Studebaker trucks had made the journey via the Arctic convoys, enabling Soviet forces to transport food and ammunition faster than horse-drawn wagons ever could. Engineers at the US Army Materiel Command coordinated closely with Soviet counterparts to ensure compatibility. Fuel types, spare parts, and maintenance procedures were standardized, reducing the risk of breakdowns in the field. German reconnaissance officers, observing the Red Army's revived mobility, would later note their surprise. Where once the Russians crawled on foot, now they roll forward in mechanical precision. The journey from American factories to Soviet railheads was perilous. Liberty ships were vulnerable to Luftwaffe air raids and U-boat patrols. Convoys braved icy seas, with crew members writing in logs about freezing decks, ice-encrusted rigging, and the constant hum of anti-submarine aircraft overhead. The Naval History and Heritage Command records detailed losses in convoys PQ-17 and QP-13, where dozens of ships were sunk or damaged. Yet, despite these setbacks, the operation persisted. By mid-1942, the US had shipped hundreds of thousands of tons of rations, each crate a small reinforcement of Soviet endurance. At the railheads, Soviet quartermasters transformed these deliveries into operational lifelines. Trains carrying rations, ammunition, and vehicles rumbled eastward on repaired tracks, often under German artillery fire. Each locomotive became a critical artery of survival. Post-war interrogations of German officers revealed disbelief at the volume and speed of distribution. They moved tons of food across hundreds of kilometers with precision. We could not have imagined such efficiency, confessed an Oberleutnant captured near Vyazma. Soldiers, previously derided for weakness, now advanced with the backing of a supply network that could rival any European army. Even so, challenges remained. Roads in occupied and contested areas were often little more than mud tracks. Bridges destroyed by retreating forces slowed progress. Winter storms threatened the newly repaired tracks, freezing rivers and splitting rail lines. Yet Soviet ingenuity prevailed. Engineers used temporary wooden trestles, improvised ferries, and horse teams to move supplies where vehicles could not traverse. Diaries from Red Army logistics units describe a constant improvisation, every ton of rations fought for, every vehicle kept operational through ingenuity and sweat. The German High Command continued to monitor the Eastern Front with skepticism. Initial reports emphasized their expectation that starvation would thin Soviet ranks before winter. Yet by late 1942, these assessments began to shift subtly. German intelligence noted the arrival of American rations, trucks, and even tractors in captured reports and interrogations. Field officers recorded that Soviet soldiers no longer appeared gaunt and exhausted. Instead, they moved with renewed stamina, artillery units firing more consistently, infantry advancing with a rhythm previously unseen. Historians later would identify this period as the turning point in Soviet operational resilience. The combination of American industrial output and Soviet resourcefulness created a logistical system capable of sustaining millions of soldiers under conditions that would have broken armies less disciplined, less inventive, or less supported. By the time the Wehrmacht reached Stalingrad in late 1942, they faced not a starving, desperate opponent, but an army increasingly fortified by international supplies and unbroken resolve. In small villages along the rail lines, civilians observed the transformation as well. Crates of food, clothes, and medical supplies reached even the remotest settlements. Letters from villagers describe astonishment at the sudden appearance of American goods. Tins of meat, sugar, and flour arrived like miracles. Our children ate for the first time in months without fear. These supplies were intended for the military, yet their presence stabilized the home front, freeing more men to join the fight, while women and children contributed to local logistics efforts. By the end of 1942, the first phase of this transcontinental supply chain had proved its worth. Millions of Soviet soldiers now received consistent nourishment, motorized units operated more efficiently, and logistical improvisation had become a force multiplier. The Germans, who had once mocked Soviet inefficiency, now faced an enemy sustained by both human ingenuity and industrial might half a world away. The seeds of a strategic reversal, planted quietly in American factories and Arctic ports, were beginning to bear fruit. The stage was set for a new chapter in the Eastern Front, one where food, fuel, and steel would determine not merely survival, but the capacity to resist, counterattack, and ultimately change the course of the war. The mockery of summer 1941 was giving way to a respect tempered by fear. The Red Army was no longer simply surviving, it was beginning to thrive. By the spring of 1942, the consequences of the American industrial lifeline were rippling across the Eastern Front. Where German reconnaissance had once seen skeletal infantry and abandoned artillery, the landscape now suggested a transformation. Well-fed soldiers manning restored vehicles, ammunition arriving on time, and entire divisions capable of sustained operations. The Lend-Lease shipments of food, trucks, and essential materials were no longer simply supplements. They had become a backbone of Soviet resilience. In the outskirts of Leningrad, Soviet units had survived the brutal siege largely through improvisation and rationing. By March 1942, the first substantial Lend-Lease supplies had arrived. Convoys brought trucks, Red Cross parcels, and thousands of tons of canned meat and powdered milk. Diaries from the 8th Army describe soldiers eating American Spam for the first time in months, an experience that contrasted starkly with prior survival on meagre bread, root vegetables, and ersatz meat substitutes. Private Sergei Ivanovich wrote, "It was as if the West itself had reached across the frozen lakes to place nourishment in our hands." This influx of supplies directly affected operational mobility. The previously grinding marches over thawed mud and destroyed roads were mitigated by hundreds of Studebaker trucks. Engineers and logistics officers adapted them for field conditions, often combining American technology with Soviet ingenuity. Reinforced wheels for muddy tracks, improvised trailers for moving artillery, and makeshift winter tires for the harsh Siberian cold. Combat units that had once been constrained by limited transportation could now execute more complex maneuvers. German observers noted this shift with growing incredulity. Field reports from Army Group Center in June 1942 recorded repeated instances where Soviet forces, once expected to collapse under hunger and exhaustion, executed coordinated counterattacks. Oberstleutnant Klaus Richter wrote in his diary, "They are no longer the huddled men we derided in 1941. They advance with energy, and trucks carry their supplies faster than our cavalry could have dreamed." Lend-Lease was not limited to rations and vehicles. Essential industrial tools, field medical kits, winter clothing, and portable generators accompanied shipments. These materials allowed the Red Army to sustain frontline operations while maintaining reserves of food and ammunition. Hospitals received blankets, surgical instruments, and pharmaceutical supplies that had been scarce since the German advance in 1941. Post-war accounts from Soviet medics recall the morale boost these deliveries provided. Soldiers knew they were not abandoned, the West sent support, and it arrived on time. The role of supply in altering combat outcomes became apparent during the Battle of Kharkov in May 1942. Soviet divisions, initially hampered by prior losses and harsh winter conditions, were now resupplied with American rations and mechanized transport. Logistics officers were able to maintain unit cohesion during rapid retreats and advances. Artillery units moved heavier shells more efficiently, while infantry benefited from calorie-rich rations that restored endurance. Casualty rates due to starvation and exposure declined significantly. The Germans, expecting exhausted Soviet units, faced well-fed and maneuverable forces capable of resisting encirclement. The psychological impact on German soldiers was equally significant. Letters and post-war memoirs reveal a gradual shift from mockery to grudging respect. A company commander stationed near Voronezh recounted, "We laughed at their starvation." Now they march with the weight of provisions that sustain them far beyond what nature should allow. German intelligence reports reflected a growing awareness. The Red Army's recovery was not spontaneous. It was fueled by an industrial colossus across the ocean, beyond the reach of Nazi air power. At the same time, the scale of American shipments increased. By mid-1942, convoys carried tens of thousands of tons of food and material. The Arctic route remained perilous. Storms and German naval threats persisted. Convoy PQ-16 in May 1942 faced repeated Luftwaffe attacks and U-boat ambushes. Ships were torpedoed, bombed, and forced to turn back, yet the overall volume of supplies reached Soviet ports in sufficient quantities to continue sustaining frontline operations. Naval logs detail crews working under constant danger, often freezing in Arctic winds, to ensure each crate arrived at its destination. Soviet logistical ingenuity played a crucial role in transforming these shipments into operational capability. Rail networks, damaged in retreats and bombings, were repaired with astonishing speed. Temporary spurs were built to reach forward positions, often using local labour conscripted for the purpose. Horses and sleds transported supplies where vehicles could not traverse deep mud or snow. Quartermasters improvised storage depots from barns, warehouses, and abandoned factories, creating a chain of sustenance that reached even the most remote riflemen. The combination of American industrial output and Soviet adaptability began to shift the balance in regional engagements. Where previously attacks faltered due to lack of food, ammunition, or mobility, units now advanced in coordinated offensives. Engineers repaired destroyed bridges quickly, artillery maintained continuous fire, and infantry units could sustain marches and assaults without catastrophic attrition. The Germans, accustomed to a starving enemy, found their calculations increasingly inaccurate. By late summer 1942, the narrative of German superiority over Soviet logistics was fundamentally challenged. Reports from German High Command acknowledged that Soviet units, once vulnerable and disorganized, now presented a formidable challenge. A captured officer later testified, "Their ability to maintain movement, feed their troops, and repair infrastructure, this was beyond our expectations. We underestimated the power of foreign aid." The German assumption that Soviet inefficiency would decide the war had been shattered, replaced by the realization that logistics, fueled by American industry, was as decisive as bullets and tanks. The Soviets themselves recognized the transformative impact of Lend-Lease supplies. Operational planning increasingly assumed the availability of American rations and vehicles. Tactical decisions accounted for greater endurance and mechanized mobility. Soldiers reported higher morale, knowing that their survival and effectiveness were underwritten not solely by their resilience, but by the support flowing steadily from across the Atlantic. In small towns along the supply routes, the presence of American rations became a symbol of hope. Villagers described crates marked with English labels, Spam, canned peaches, powdered milk, arriving alongside locomotives and trucks. Even in war-torn regions, the arrival of these supplies sustained civilian life, reduced starvation, and freed soldiers to fight rather than forage. The combined effect of industry, transportation, and human ingenuity began to manifest as a force multiplier. By the end of 1942, the stage was set for a new phase of the Eastern Front. The Red Army, previously beleaguered by hunger, exhaustion, and logistical bottlenecks, now possessed the sustenance and mobility to conduct coordinated counter-offensives. The German mockery of Soviet supply chains had transformed into cautious respect, tempered by fear. What began as an ocean-spanning experiment in industrial logistics had become a decisive element in determining the survival and resurgence of millions of Red Army soldiers. The tides of supply, once a distant promise from American factories, were now a tangible force shaping battles, morale, and the trajectory of the war. As the Wehrmacht prepared for its next operations, they faced not a disorganized, starving foe, but an army increasingly capable, well-fed, and resilient, its lifeblood flowing across continents, under Arctic ice, and along the rails of a nation refusing to yield. The winter of 1942 to 1943 arrived on the Eastern Front with merciless intensity. Temperatures plunged well below -30 degrees Celsius in the Russian steppes, and the German Wehrmacht, already stretched thin by extended supply lines, struggled to maintain positions. Starvation, frostbite, and exhaustion were constant threats for both sides. But the Soviets were increasingly shielded by the steady influx of American Lend-Lease support, a lifeline that would prove decisive in the coming battles. Soviet troops endured months of scarcity in prior winters, subsisting on frozen roots, ersatz bread, and a diet largely devoid of protein. Diaries from riflemen of the 62nd Army during the defense of Stalingrad recount the debilitating effects. Hands numb, legs heavy, the stomach hollow, we survived on hope and scraps. Many comrades simply could not continue. Yet by the winter of 1942 to 43, the impact of American shipments was becoming unmistakable. Trucks, food, winter clothing, and medical supplies had arrived in quantities sufficient to support frontline operations even under extreme conditions. American rations, particularly canned meat and processed foods like Spam, had an outsized effect. Soldiers, previously weakened by months of minimal sustenance, experienced restored energy and endurance. These rations were calorically dense, portable, and resilient against freezing temperatures, making them ideal for frontline deployment. Reports from Soviet logistics officers detail distribution centers in the Volga and Don regions, where crates of American food were systematically allocated to divisions, ensuring that no soldier went more than a day without sufficient nourishment. Mechanization amplified the effect of these supplies. Studebaker trucks and other Lend-Lease vehicles were adapted for winter use. Engines were winterized, wheels reinforced for snow, and crews trained in cold weather maintenance. The trucks enabled rapid transport of food, ammunition, and medical supplies to forward positions, compensating for damaged or frozen rail lines. Operational reports from the 62nd and 64th Armies highlight the contrast. Whereas in 1941 a frozen march could leave regiments immobilized for days, by 1942 supply convoys reached forward units reliably, sustaining their combat effectiveness. The Battle of Stalingrad, which raged from August 1942 into February 1943, became the crucible demonstrating the strategic significance of sustained logistics. German intelligence initially assumed the Soviet defenders would collapse under starvation and exposure. Field reports of early November 1942 noted, with typical derision, that Soviet troops were clinging to the city like vermin, scraping frostbitten potatoes from ruined cellars. Yet these assessments failed to account for the new operational reality. American rations, delivered by rail and truck, reached encircled units within the city, providing enough calories to maintain resistance even under continuous artillery bombardment. Medical supplies also played a crucial role. Lend-Lease deliveries included field hospitals, surgical instruments, and pharmaceuticals. Soviet medics credited these supplies with reducing mortality rates among frostbite victims and wounded soldiers. Interrogation reports from captured German officers described their shock at the resilience of Soviet units, despite sustained bombardment and the harsh winter. One officer noted, "We expected them to crumble in the cold, yet they advanced, repaired positions, and counterattacked. Their endurance was unnatural, bolstered by supplies from across the sea." The psychological impact on German troops cannot be understated. Letters and diaries from soldiers in Army Group South recount incredulity at the sustained Soviet resistance. Oberleutnant Heinz Krause wrote, "We believed them starving, yet they fight, move, and repair as if fed by 100 kitchens. What sorcery is this?" In reality, it was industrial power combined with meticulous logistical planning, the movement of thousands of tons of food and equipment from American factories to Soviet battlefields. Lend-Lease shipments were not merely food and trucks. Winter clothing and footwear were essential. American coats, boots, gloves, and mittens mitigated frostbite and exposure. Soviet engineers adapted these garments to the harsh Russian winter, distributing them through regiment-level depots. Soldiers' letters from this period frequently mention the practical value of the clothing, warmth that allowed patrols, reconnaissance missions, and counterattacks even in temperatures that previously immobilized entire units. Rail lines, often the arteries of Soviet supply, were repaired at a remarkable pace. Engineers and labor brigades reconstructed bridges, cleared snow-blocked tracks, and improvised detours, allowing convoys of trucks and freight cars to maintain a steady flow of supplies. Observers from German reconnaissance units noted that damaged infrastructure, long assumed to be a strategic advantage for the Wehrmacht, was now systematically restored. Supply reliability became a force multiplier, enabling continuous pressure on German flanks and facilitating coordinated counter-offensives. In addition to the physical benefits, the mere presence of sustained supplies bolstered morale. Letters from the front describe soldiers' renewed confidence, knowing that food, warmth, and ammunition would arrive. Troops were able to endure bombardments, hold defensive lines, and prepare for offensive operations. Even in encirclement, such as the Soviet positions in Stalingrad, soldiers reported a sense of security that contrasted sharply with the despair of the previous year. Strategically, the winter of 1942–43 marked a turning point in operational planning. Soviet commanders, emboldened by improved supply lines, initiated counter-offensives that German intelligence struggled to anticipate. Operations Uranus and Saturn, which encircled the German Sixth Army, were facilitated by the fact that Soviet troops could advance with reliable rations, mechanized support, and medical backing. American logistical aid, once perceived as auxiliary, had become a cornerstone of operational feasibility. By February 1943, when the last German units in Stalingrad surrendered, the significance of the American lifeline was clear. Millions of Red Army soldiers, previously expected to succumb to hunger and harsh winter, had not only survived but fought with a tenacity that altered the course of the war. Memoirs of Soviet generals repeatedly acknowledge the pivotal role of Lend-Lease supplies. Trucks, rations, and winter gear had transformed a war of attrition into one in which the Soviets could seize the initiative. In the eyes of German command, the mockery of Soviet inefficiency was no longer sustainable. Operational assessments acknowledged that the enemy's logistical revival, fueled by American industry, had materially contributed to the failures of the Wehrmacht in southern Russia. The myth of inevitable Soviet collapse had been shattered, replaced by a grim reality. The Red Army, nourished and supplied by an ocean away, was capable of enduring extremes and mounting decisive offensives. As spring approached, the landscape of the Eastern Front had shifted. Hunger no longer dictated the pace of operations. Cold was no longer an insurmountable enemy. The strategic calculus had changed fundamentally. Where once the Germans anticipated quick victories over starving, demoralized troops, they now faced an enemy strengthened by the sustained, tangible support of American production, a lifeline that ensured survival, operational mobility, and the capacity for large-scale counter-offensives. The winter of 1942–43 stands as a testament to the transformative power of logistics in modern warfare. It demonstrated that industrial might, when effectively channeled into sustenance and mobility, could shape battlefield outcomes as decisively as tanks or artillery. The Red Army, once derided and underestimated, had survived the crucible of winter through the combined ingenuity of its own forces and the steady hand of distant allies. The stage was set for the next phase of the war, where supply would continue to prove as decisive as strategy and courage. Spring 1943 brought a transformed Eastern Front. The frozen plains that had immobilized soldiers just months earlier were now thawing, revealing the scars of brutal winter warfare. The German Wehrmacht, exhausted and depleted by the failed assault on Stalingrad, faced an enemy whose strength had been silently fortified across the ocean. The Red Army, reinforced by American trucks, rations, and winter clothing, was no longer merely surviving. It was advancing. Operation Little Saturn, launched in December 1942 and extending into January, had encircled German forces in the Don River region. By the spring, Soviet divisions were pushing westward, exploiting German weaknesses. Reports from the 13th Fighter Command observers note the logistical edge. Soviet motorized corps could sustain long-distance maneuvers, thanks largely to Studebaker trucks and jeeps delivered via Lend-Lease. Where German infantry and armoured units struggled with fuel shortages and worn vehicles, Soviet units moved with a newfound reliability, resupplying at rates previously deemed impossible. Civilians and partisans contributed to the war effort, but the presence of American food and machinery amplified their impact. Canned meat, powdered milk, and other high-calorie rations reached forward positions, enabling infantry to march and fight over distances that had previously led to collapse. Diaries of Soviet junior officers describe a shift in morale. The men joke about the Americans sending us tins of meat, yet their strength carries us forward. For the first time in months, victory feels tangible. The psychological impact on German troops remained stark. Captured Wehrmacht soldiers repeatedly noted their surprise at encountering well-fed, mobile Soviet units in areas where starvation should have crippled resistance. One sergeant, taken prisoner near Kharkov, wrote in his interrogation report, "We expected skeletons, yet they attacked in waves, strong, disciplined and relentless. It is as if some unseen force nourishes them." The unseen force was, in reality, a meticulously maintained supply chain linking American industrial output to the heart of the Soviet front. Soviet commanders leveraged this logistical advantage to conduct coordinated offensives, integrating infantry, armour and artillery in ways that German field reports acknowledged were increasingly difficult to counter. Fuel, ammunition and food reached forward positions faster than the Germans could anticipate, allowing sustained attacks even in regions with partially destroyed rail networks. Reports from the 5th Guards Tank Army detail the reliability of Lend-Lease trucks in supplying both fuel and food, emphasizing that mobility, coupled with endurance, had become a decisive factor. Air operations further showcased the strategic shift. Soviet airfields, supplied with winterized vehicles and maintenance equipment from Lend-Lease shipments, maintained operational tempos that German intelligence struggled to track. Aircraft could be refueled, rearmed, and sent on successive sorties with minimal downtime, enabling close air support that directly influenced ground battles. Intelligence officers from Luftwaffe reconnaissance noted, with growing frustration, that Soviet air activity in the spring of 1943 was far more aggressive and effective than previous winters, a clear sign of sustained logistical efficiency. By late spring, the balance of initiative had decisively shifted. German troops were forced onto defensive positions, retreating under pressure in several sectors. The Red Army's ability to supply and sustain mobile offensives, previously deemed improbable, was now undeniable. The combination of American rations, vehicles, and winter clothing had transformed the Soviet military from a beleaguered, struggling force into an operationally resilient, offensive-capable army. Where once German high command mocked Soviet logistical inefficiency, the reality on the ground forced a grudging reassessment. Lend-Lease support had allowed millions of Red Army soldiers to endure starvation, survive the winter, and push the front lines westward. The winter of 1942–43, followed by the spring offensive, demonstrated that industrialized supply, even from across an ocean, could decisively alter the outcome of battles. The mockery of the Red Army had ended. In its place stood a stark acknowledgement. The Soviets, fed by American industry, were no longer a force to underestimate. Their endurance, mobility, and fighting capacity would continue to shape the Eastern Front in the months and years to come. By mid-1943, the German Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front was confronting a reality its high command had long refused to acknowledge. The once invincible army, capable of lightning advances across Europe, now struggled to hold a line against an opponent that was, quite literally, fed by a foreign hand. Across the Don River and the Kuban, German divisions that had survived the winter of 1942–43 were battered, fatigued, and increasingly demoralized. The Red Army, bolstered by American rations, trucks, and winter equipment, was no longer a force to be mocked. It was a deadly adversary reclaiming territory with relentless efficiency. Field reports from Army Group South illustrate the depth of German difficulties. Supply shortages, exacerbated by partisan attacks on rail lines and destroyed bridges, hampered the movement of fuel, ammunition, and food. Infantry units, already suffering from extended exposure to harsh weather, reported exhaustion and hunger. One diary entry from a Panzer grenadier officer noted, "Our troops retreat slowly, but even their strength fails us." The Soviets press on, strong and fed. It is a terrible sight. Men who should have starved yet move with vigour, sustained by an invisible river of supplies. The source of that invisible river was increasingly evident. Lend-Lease shipments, arriving from American ports via the Murmansk convoys and Persian corridor, provided the Red Army with food, vehicles, and equipment far beyond what Germany's intelligence had anticipated. Studebaker trucks, jeeps, and even spare parts for tanks allowed Soviet armoured units to manoeuvre across terrain that had immobilized German formations for months. By contrast, German logistics relied heavily on rail networks under constant threat from Soviet partisans, and their mobile units often faced shortages of fuel and repair materials. The psychological impact of these logistical disparities was profound. In captured German reports, officers repeatedly expressed disbelief at the resilience of the Soviet forces. One report from the 6th Army, retreating from Kharkov, reads, "We expected skeletons, starving and broken, yet they advance in formation, well supplied, disciplined and unyielding. Our men ask how this is possible, for our own supplies are exhausted." The contrast was undeniable. German soldiers were hungry, cold, and increasingly demoralized, while their opponents maintained strength through the steady flow of American food and vehicles. Soviet operational planning reflected this advantage. Commanders coordinated multi-pronged offensives, combining infantry, artillery, and armoured columns in a manner only made possible by reliable logistics. Forward supply depots, stocked with American rations and winter gear, allowed units to conduct extended operations without the constant need to return to the rear. In the spring and early summer, Soviet forces recaptured towns and river crossings, forcing German divisions into defensive positions along the Donets River. Combat records from Soviet mechanized corps underscore the impact of Lend-Lease trucks in maintaining mobility. Tank units, often accompanied by supply columns of American vehicles, could advance rapidly, resupply at forward positions, and exploit gaps in German lines. Intelligence reports from German Panzer divisions described repeated encounters with Soviet units appearing suddenly, where no German reconnaissance had predicted. Fuel, food, and ammunition reached these forward units efficiently, allowing continued offensive operations. Air superiority, or at least parity, also shifted in favour of the Soviets. Forward airfields, supported by Lend-Lease trucks carrying fuel and maintenance equipment, allowed for continuous sorties against retreating German formations. Aircraft could strike supply depots, troop concentrations, and advancing armour with greater frequency and reliability than the Luftwaffe could counter. German pilots noted the relentless nature of these attacks, remarking on the endurance of Soviet air operations, something that would have been impossible during the winter of 1941–42 without foreign support. As the summer progressed, the Wehrmacht's morale further deteriorated. Soldiers complained of being overextended, with insufficient food, unreliable transport, and a constant pressure from well-supplied Soviet units. Captured diaries and letters from German troops frequently mention disbelief at the Red Army's ability to sustain itself. They fight like we are supposed to fight, yet they eat, rest, and advance while we crawl on empty stomachs. It is as if an invisible hand nourishes them. In response, German commanders attempted counter-offensives to stabilize the front, but these efforts were hampered by the same logistical weaknesses that plagued the retreat. Fuel shortages delayed armoured movements. Infantry units lacked sufficient rations to sustain prolonged engagement, and German artillery frequently outranged Soviet positions, only to be silenced by precise counter-battery fire enabled by rapid Soviet supply. The contrast between the two forces was clear. The Red Army could fight sustained, coordinated battles, while German units increasingly fought piecemeal, reacting to threats rather than seizing the initiative. By July 1943, the situation had reached a critical point. The German defensive line along the Donets was eroding, retreating under pressure from a Red Army now confident in its logistical superiority. The combination of American rations, vehicles, and equipment had transformed the Soviet army from a beleaguered, desperate force into an operationally resilient, mobile, and offensively capable military. Where once German intelligence reports mocked Soviet inefficiency, they now reluctantly acknowledged a new reality. The supply lines of the United States had enabled millions of Red Army soldiers to endure starvation, recover from brutal winters, and push the Wehrmacht back across the plains of southern Russia. The Wehrmacht reeled. Retreats became ordered withdrawals, defensive lines shortened, and commanders struggled to maintain cohesion among exhausted troops. Meanwhile, Soviet planners, empowered by reliable supply chains, prepared for larger offensives. The tide of war was no longer a question of bravery or ideology. It was the tangible result of industrial capacity, logistics, and the quiet power of food, fuel, and transport reaching those who needed it most. By the end of the summer, the lesson was unmistakable. An army fed, clothed, and mobile could recover from setbacks that might otherwise have proved catastrophic. German mockery had given way to grudging respect and fear. Across the Eastern Front, the Red Army advanced, not just surviving, but thriving, and the US supplied provisions that made it possible had rewritten the rules of engagement. By late summer 1943, the Eastern Front had reached a critical inflection point. German divisions, battered by months of attrition, shortages, and relentless Soviet pressure, were no longer capable of sustaining offensive operations. Across southern Russia, the Red Army was transitioning from recovery to sustained offensive action, buoyed by the industrial and logistical lifelines supplied by the United States. The once mocked Soviet soldiers, nourished and equipped by American rations, trucks, and vehicles, now moved with confidence and coordination that German commanders had long deemed impossible. The liberation of strategic towns along the Donets and Dnieper rivers illustrated this transformation. Soviet mechanized units, supported by Lend-Lease trucks carrying fuel, artillery ammunition, and rations, executed multi-directional assaults with remarkable efficiency. Field reports from the 5th Guards Tank Army emphasize the operational fluidity enabled by these supplies. Our armoured columns advance rapidly, supported by mobile supply points. Fuel and rations arrive without delay, allowing continued operations beyond what would have been previously possible. German intelligence recognized the mounting threat but struggled to respond. Divisions attempting to reinforce faltering lines encountered persistent Soviet harassment, with Red Army troops exploiting gaps and weak points in the German positions. Captured Wehrmacht communications reveal growing alarm. Enemy units continue to operate beyond our anticipated resupply points. Their endurance and speed cannot be explained by their own resources. They are clearly aided by substantial external support. One of the most striking examples of this turning tide occurred near Kharkov. German defensive positions, initially deemed strong, were systematically dismantled by Soviet combined arms operations. Infantry advanced in close coordination with mechanized units, sustained by mobile supply depots brought forward via American trucks and rail shipments. Where German artillery had previously suppressed Soviet movements, counter-battery fire now neutralized their guns, thanks to precise targeting enabled by mobile observers and rapid communication. The effectiveness of these operations forced the Wehrmacht into a phased withdrawal, retreating along pre-planned lines but under relentless pressure. The morale effect on German troops was profound. Letters and diaries from soldiers report disbelief at the endurance and coordination of Soviet forces. One entry from a veteran of the 6th Panzer Division notes, "We expected a broken enemy, yet they fight with vigour. They are fed, rested and equipped. Our supplies dwindle, our men tire. I fear this is the beginning of a long retreat that cannot be stopped." The contrast between starving German units and well-fed Soviet formations could not have been starker. At the operational level, Soviet commanders demonstrated an increasing mastery of combined arms warfare, integrating infantry, armour, artillery and air support with logistical precision. Lend-Lease trucks and jeeps allowed forward positioning of supply depots, enabling continuous operations without the need for extended halts. Ammunition and fuel were delivered to units in real time, a practice that would have been impossible without the American industrial contribution. Commanders leveraged this advantage to maintain tempo, striking repeatedly at exposed German flanks and forcing hasty withdrawals. The impact of Lend-Lease rations was equally tangible. US-produced canned meats, powdered milk, and other non-perishable goods supplied millions of Red Army soldiers, sustaining morale and physical endurance in harsh conditions. For many Soviet units, these provisions were the difference between operational effectiveness and collapse. Where once German propaganda mocked the hungry backward Red Army, soldiers now faced opponents who were not only resilient, but strategically and tactically adept. Air operations also reflected the changing dynamic. Forward Soviet airfields, maintained with the aid of American trucks, fuel and spare parts, allowed continuous sorties against retreating German formations. Reconnaissance planes provided timely intelligence, while fighters and bombers struck supply depots and troop concentrations. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin and increasingly defensive, could not prevent the Red Army from achieving local air superiority in critical sectors. German pilots repeatedly noted the precision and endurance of Soviet air operations, testimony to a logistical system previously unthinkable. The cumulative effect of these developments forced the Wehrmacht into a series of strategic withdrawals across the southern front. While these retreats were executed in an orderly fashion, they nonetheless reflected a loss of initiative that had defined German strategy in 1941–42. German commanders, once confident in their superiority, now grappled with the reality that sustained Soviet offensives, underwritten by American logistical support, could dictate the tempo of the war. By the autumn of 1943, the balance of power along the Donetsk and Dnieper regions had irrevocably shifted. German High Command, once mocking Soviet logistical weakness, now acknowledged the formidable capabilities of an enemy nourished by foreign industry. US supplies, rations, trucks, fuel, and winter gear had transformed the Red Army from a beleaguered force into a resilient, mobile, and offensively capable military. The tide of war, once assumed to favour German arms, had decisively begun to turn. The operational success of Soviet forces during this period would set the stage for the monumental offensives of 1944. Cities and territories recaptured in 1943 provided staging grounds for further advances, demonstrating the crucial interplay of logistics, planning, and foreign support. German forces, unable to match the logistical efficiency of their opponents, increasingly relied on ad hoc measures to delay the inevitable. Across the Eastern Front, soldiers and officers alike recognized the emerging truth. The Red Army, sustained by American rations and industrial might, was no longer a force to underestimate. By the end of the year, the Wehrmacht's position had hardened into one of defensive desperation. Retreats were no longer tactical maneuvers, but necessities dictated by the logistical superiority of the enemy. German mockery of Soviet inefficiency had vanished, replaced by cautious respect and growing anxiety. Operation Barbarossa, once a confident strike into the heart of the Soviet Union, had been reversed, and the combination of Soviet resilience and American support had rewritten the rules of the Eastern Front. By the onset of winter 1943, the Eastern Front had been irrevocably altered. The German army, once confident of a swift victory over the Soviet Union, was now entrenched in a series of defensive lines across Ukraine and southern Russia. Soviet forces, emboldened and sustained by the steady flow of American supplies, had shifted from recovery and localized offensives to a sustained push westward. The resilience of Red Army units, combined with the logistical lifelines delivered via Lend-Lease, now dictated the tempo of the conflict. The Long March West was not merely a tactical maneuver, it was the cumulative result of years of endurance, adaptation, and foreign support. Soviet operational planning had reached a level previously unattainable during the desperate months of 1941–42. Infantry, mechanized corps, and armoured divisions coordinated with precision, supported by mobile supply units equipped with US-made trucks, jeeps, and fuel reserves. Fuel shortages, once a crippling weakness, were mitigated by Lend-Lease petroleum shipments, enabling sustained armoured thrusts and rapid redeployments. One striking example occurred during the Soviet advance toward the Dnieper River in late 1943. German defensive positions, fortified over months of occupation, were systematically dismantled through a combination of artillery barrages, air support, and mechanized assaults. US-supplied rations allowed soldiers to maintain extended operational readiness, even during sub-zero temperatures. Letters from Soviet infantrymen described the morale boost these supplies provided. "The food we carry now keeps us strong. We march farther, fight harder. We are no longer starving, and our enemies can see it." German field reports confirmed the growing awareness of American involvement. Intelligence officers noted the unexpected endurance and mobility of Red Army units, often attributing their operational effectiveness to a mysterious, well-supplied system. Wehrmacht diaries reveal a shift in tone from derision to cautious respect. Our reports of Soviet supply failures were mistaken. The enemy moves with vigour. Their fuel and rations arrive in a manner beyond our anticipation. The Long March West was also characterized by the methodical recapture of strategic towns and transportation hubs. Soviet engineers, supplied with American tools and vehicles, repaired rail lines and roads damaged by retreating Germans, ensuring that supply chains remained uninterrupted. Artillery units were resupplied directly at the front, while forward field hospitals received US-made medical kits and preserved foods. The integration of logistics and combat operations became a defining feature of the Red Army's winter campaigns. Air support played a crucial role in facilitating the westward push. Forward Soviet airfields, maintained with US-supplied vehicles and equipment, allowed continuous reconnaissance and tactical bombing. German troops, already strained by harsh winter conditions, faced persistent harassment from Soviet aircraft targeting supply depots, troop concentrations, and retreating columns. The Luftwaffe, stretched across multiple fronts, could not effectively counter these coordinated air-ground operations. The impact of Lend-Lease on winter operations cannot be overstated. Canned meats, powdered milk, and preserved rations allowed soldiers to sustain energy over long marches in sub-zero temperatures. Trucks and jeeps transported not only supplies, but also artillery, communications equipment, and medical aid, enabling the Red Army to maintain operational tempo despite environmental and enemy challenges. This logistical advantage transformed what might have been a slow, attritional advance into a rapid and coordinated campaign. By December 1943, German forces had been pushed back across vast swaths of southern Russia, with defensive positions increasingly strained along the Dnieper and Desna rivers. Retreating units faced not only the physical challenges of winter, but also the psychological impact of confronting a well-supplied and increasingly confident opponent. German letters and diaries from this period reveal a dawning realization. The war's outcome on the Eastern Front was no longer determined solely by German tactical skill, but by the enduring power of sustained logistics and foreign aid. The Long March West also highlighted the evolving professionalism of Soviet leadership. Corps and division commanders skillfully coordinated mechanized and infantry units, often exploiting weaknesses in German defensive lines identified through air reconnaissance and forward intelligence. Supply officers, working closely with operational commanders, ensured that fuel, ammunition, and food were delivered in near real time, a feat that would have been unthinkable in the early months of Barbarossa. As 1943 drew to a close, the Red Army had recaptured significant portions of territory lost in 1941, while the Wehrmacht faced an increasingly untenable position. The combination of resilience, operational acumen, and the transformative effect of American Lend-Lease supplies had reversed the course of the Eastern Front. What German High Command had once mocked as a starving, incompetent army had emerged as a formidable, well-supplied and strategically capable force. The Long March West set the stage for the monumental offensives of 1944, demonstrating the decisive role that logistics, international support, and sustained operational planning played in modern warfare. By the winter of 1943, the Eastern Front had become a proving ground not just for combat prowess, but for the enduring power of supply lines, morale, and the unanticipated effects of global collaboration.